The night of September 17th, 1788, descended upon the Timis River Valley with a heavy, suffocating darkness. In the fields surrounding the town of Karánsebes, an immense military force lay waiting, their campfires burning like a fallen constellation against the black earth. Over 100,000 men of the Austrian army had been assembled to hold the line against a terrifying, encroaching threat. They were braced for slaughter, their weapons primed, their nerves pulled taut by the anticipation of a brutal dawn. Yet, when the sun finally rose, the fields would indeed be choked with the dead. But the enemy they had feared all night was nowhere to be found. To comprehend the sheer scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold, one must understand the fragile architecture of the empire that had marched into this valley. The Austro-Turkish War had been initiated by Emperor Joseph II, a monarch driven by grand ambitions to expand his borders and push back the formidable Ottoman Empire. To achieve this, he had conscripted a massive, sprawling war machine, a leviathan of military might designed to crush any opposition in its path. But this leviathan was deeply flawed, built upon a foundation of forced unity that was already cracking under the immense pressure of the campaign. The Austrian army was a polyglot patchwork of a fractured empire. It was composed not just of Austrians, but of Serbs, Croats, Hungarians, Italians, and minorities from across Central Europe. They were a mosaic of cultures forced into a single uniform, bound together by imperial decree rather than shared identity. The most fatal fracture within this massive force was linguistic. The officers, drawn primarily from the Austrian nobility, issued their commands exclusively in German. The conscripts, however, spoke a dizzying array of native tongues, creating a daily reality where orders were often misunderstood, mistranslated, or entirely ignored. It was an army where the right hand could not speak to the left, a precarious chain of command suspended over a powder keg of cultural division. As this fractured host marched toward Karánsebes, the physical and psychological toll of the campaign began to erode whatever discipline remained. The late summer heat was oppressive, and the swamplands bred malaria and dysentery, invisible plagues that quietly decimated the ranks before a single sword was drawn. Every soldier marched under the suffocating, omnipresent shadow of the Ottoman vanguard, a phantom menace that haunted their exhausted minds. On that fateful evening, as the main body of the army established its sprawling encampment, a contingent of cavalry was dispatched across the Timis River. These hussars, elite and fiercely proud mounted troops, were ordered to scout the surrounding woods for any sign of the approaching Turks. They rode into the gathering twilight, their sabers rattling in the quiet dusk, expecting at any moment to collide with the enemy vanguard. Instead of an ambush, the hussars found a fleeting moment of salvation in the form of a small band of Romani travelers. The travelers had set up a makeshift camp, and more importantly, they carried with them several large barrels of schnapps. For the exhausted, paranoid cavalrymen, this was a miraculous reprieve from the grim reality of the war. They eagerly purchased the liquor, dismounted, and began to drink deeply, seeking to drown the dread of the impending battle. The brief respite was shattered by the arrival of a company of infantry. These foot soldiers had also crossed the river, trudging through the mud, their throats parched and their bodies aching from the relentless march. Seeing the hussars reveling around the wooden casks, the infantrymen approached, demanding a share of the potent spirit. They were brothers in arms, facing the same death, and they felt entitled to the same fleeting comfort. The hussars flatly refused. The deep-seated arrogance of the mounted elite clashed violently with the desperate resentment of the foot soldiers. The cavalrymen formed a protective ring around their precious barrels, constructing makeshift barricades out of whatever they could find in the dark. The linguistic barriers and cultural divides that plagued the empire suddenly crystallized around a few wooden casks of cheap alcohol. Words were exchanged, insults hurled in languages only half understood, and the tension spiraled rapidly out of control. The argument turned physical, a chaotic, drunken brawl erupting on the muddy riverbank. Fists flew in the pitch black, men wrestled in the dirt, and then the fatal spark was struck. A single musket discharged, its deafening crack tearing through the silence of the night. That solitary gunshot echoed across the water, and in the profound darkness, all context instantly vanished. The infantry, already terrified of an ambush and disoriented by the chaos, heard the shot and screamed the one word every man in the valley dreaded: Turks! Turks! The cry tore from their throats, a contagious panic that infected everyone within earshot. The hussars, hearing the screams of their own infantry and believing the Ottoman vanguard had indeed arrived to slaughter them, broke and ran. They scrambled onto their horses and fled blindly back across the river, galloping wildly toward the safety of the main encampment. Behind them, the terrified infantry began firing their muskets into the shadows, shooting at the rustling leaves, the shifting trees, and each other. Mass hysteria is a terrifying contagion, capable of shattering an army's collective psychology in a matter of seconds. As the fleeing cavalry thundered into the sleeping camp, the darkness amplified every sound into the roar of an approaching horde. Thousands of exhausted, paranoid men jolted awake to the sound of gunfire and galloping hooves, their minds instantly concluding that the camp had been overrun. The fatal linguistic flaw of the Habsburg war machine now activated with devastating consequences. German-speaking officers, desperately trying to restore order amidst the surging chaos, drew their swords and shouted at the top of their lungs, "Halt! Halt!" It was a frantic plea for discipline, an attempt to stop the blind panic from consuming the army. But terror is a terrible translator. To the panicked ears of the Slavic and Hungarian conscripts, the guttural German command of "halt" morphed into something far more sinister. Through the chaotic din of the night, they misheard the officers' desperate shouts as the terrifying battle cry of the Ottoman Empire, "Allah, Allah." The camp instantly descended into a nightmare of unparalleled friendly fire. Soldiers, convinced the enemy was already among them, began firing blindly into the tents of their comrades. Bayonets were plunged into the shadows, cutting down men who were frantically trying to dress themselves. The darkness became an inescapable storm of lead and steel, where every moving figure was perceived as a hostile threat. The cavalry, lost in the labyrinth of the sprawling camp, charged wildly through the infantry lines. Men were trampled under iron hooves, their screams adding to the cacophony of the slaughter. Regiments that had marched side by side for months now turned their weapons upon one another, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat against an enemy that existed only in their terrified imaginations. The panic soon reached the artillery corps, stationed on a ridge overlooking the valley. The gunners looked down upon a sea of flashing muskets in chaotic movement, assuming the entire encampment had fallen to a massive Ottoman assault. Without waiting for orders that would never come, they ignited their fuses and opened fire on their own army. Cannonballs tore through the Austrian ranks, shattering wagons, obliterating tents, and carving bloody swathes through the terrified soldiers. The devastation was absolute, and the command structure evaporated completely. It was no longer an army. It was 100,000 men trapped in a self-inflicted meat grinder, fighting a desperate war against their own shadows. The sheer scale of the disaster soon swept up the highest echelons of the empire. Emperor Joseph II, awakened by the roar of his own artillery, realized the situation was entirely beyond his control. Believing his army was being annihilated by the Turks, he ordered a general retreat, only to have his imperial carriage swarmed by his own fleeing, panicked troops. In the frantic rush to escape the invisible slaughter, the emperor was violently pushed from his horse into a muddy creek. He survived only by sheer luck, hiding in the dark waters while his grand army trampled itself to death on the banks above. It was the ultimate, humiliating collapse of imperial authority, a monarch brought low not by a conquering rival, but by the sheer, unadulterated terror of his own men. The retreat rapidly devolved into a catastrophic rout. Pay chests brimming with gold were abandoned in the mud. Cannons were left spiked in the dirt. Supplies, weapons, and provisions were cast aside as the army scattered into the surrounding wilderness, desperate to put distance between themselves and the phantom Ottoman horde. They blew up their own bridges and tore down their own defenses in a frantic bid to slow an enemy that was not pursuing them. When the morning sun finally rose on September 18th, the thick fog slowly lifted to reveal the true, agonizing horror of the night. There were no Ottoman banners fluttering in the breeze. There were no enemy corpses scattered among the wreckage. The silence of the valley was broken only by the groans of the dying and the crackle of burning tents. 10,000 Austrian soldiers lay dead or severely wounded on the fields of Karánsebes. The lush green grass was soaked deep red with the blood of an empire that had systematically, ruthlessly bled itself. They had fought a massive, apocalyptic battle in the dark, and they had lost to no one. 2 days later, the actual forces of the Ottoman Empire finally arrived at Karánsebes. They marched into the valley prepared for a brutal, grinding siege against a superior force. Instead, they found an undefended city, a completely abandoned encampment, and a sprawling field of the dead. The enemy had done their grim work for them, leaving behind a feast for the crows and a mystery that defied all military logic. It was perhaps the easiest victory in the long, blood-soaked history of the Ottoman military. They simply walked into the aftermath of a massacre, claiming the territory without firing a single shot. The self-destruction of their foe was so complete, so utterly devastating, that it required no further action to secure the triumph. The Battle of Karánsebes remains the most absurd military disaster ever recorded in the annals of human history. It is a dark joke written in blood, a historical anomaly that defies the conventional narratives of strategy, valor, and conquest. It stands alone as a monument to the terrifying potential of collective irrationality. This event serves as a chilling testament to human frailty, proving that the grandest structures of discipline and power can dissolve in an instant. When confronted by the primal forces of panic, intoxication, and deep-seated division, the veneer of civilization and order is stripped away, leaving only the raw, destructive instinct of survival. It reveals the true fragility of order. When the mind fractures under the weight of exhaustion and paranoia, the sword inevitably turns inward. The very weapons forged to protect the empire became the instruments of its own devastating ruin. The shadows of 1788 still whisper a profound and unsettling warning across the centuries. They remind us that no matter how vast the army, no matter how thick the armor, sometimes the greatest enemy is indeed oneself. The tragedy of Karánsebes proves that the most terrifying monster in the dark is often simply the reflection of our own unchecked fear.